The air in Providence Creek had turned sharp. It was the third week of October, 1876, and the wind that swept down from the northern ridges no longer carried the scent of pine and damp earth, but the hard, sterile promise of ice. The aspens had long since shed their gold, standing like an army of pale skeletons against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. For the people of the small, isolated settlement, this was the season of final preparation, of stacking wood, salting meat, and battening down the hatches of their simple, timber-framed lives against the inevitable siege of winter. For Alara Vance, it was the season of quiet desperation. She was 19 years old. A year had passed since the mine collapse had taken her husband, Thomas, leaving her with little more than his good name and a small, rock-strewn parcel of land on the north edge of town. 3 months ago, the influenza had swept through, claiming her mother and father in the same week, leaving her utterly alone. Her world had shrunk to the confines of a small, drafty cabin her father had built, a place that now seemed to exhale the ghosts of her losses with every gust of wind that whistled through its chinking. The final blow came not from nature, but from men. On the morning of October 22nd, she stood before the town council, a tribunal of 4 grim-faced men seated behind a rough-hewn pine table in the meeting hall. The air was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and self-importance. At their head was Silas Abernathy, a man whose wealth was measured in timber and whose authority was absolute. He was a pillar of the community, which is to say he was a large, unmoving object around which all other life was forced to navigate. Alara made her request plainly and without embellishment. She asked for the customary winter wood stipend afforded to families in need. Her own supply was dangerously low, and with no husband or father to fell trees, she faced the coming cold with a dread that was almost physical. Abernathy cleared his throat, a sound like stones grinding together. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice a low rumble of condescension, "the council has reviewed your request. We find that your household, consisting of 1, does not meet the threshold of need that warrants a full stipend. A single woman requires far less fuel than a family." He paused, letting the weight of his judgment settle in the room. "It is the opinion of this council that your predicament is one of your own making. A young widow has options. You have been in mourning for a respectable period. It is past time you sought a more stable arrangement." The implication was as clear as it was cruel. She was being punished for her independence, for her failure to secure another man to provide for her. The stipend was not a matter of community support, but a tool of social control. A quiet fury, cold and hard, began to build in Alara's chest. She met Abernathy's gaze, her own clear and steady. "Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice even, "I am not seeking a husband. I am seeking to survive the winter. My need for warmth is no less than anyone else's." A younger councilman, Mr. Gable, shifted uncomfortably, but Abernathy waved a dismissive hand. "The decision is final. We will allot you 1/4 of a cord. See that you use it wisely." He looked past her, a signal that the audience was over. 1/4 of a cord. It was an insult. It was a death sentence. It would not last a month in a mild winter, and the old-timers were already whispering that this would be no mild winter. As Alara walked out of the meeting hall, the stares of the townsfolk felt like a physical weight. They were not unkind stares, not entirely. They were laced with a pity that was more humiliating than outright scorn. They saw a poor, tragic figure, a girl adrift and doomed, They did not see the iron that was hardening in her spine. That night, as the temperature plummeted and a skin of ice formed on the water in her basin, Alara did not weep. Instead, she unlatched a small wooden chest that had belonged to her grandfather. He had been a strange man, a stonemason from the old country who spoke of things the people of Providence Creek had forgotten, or perhaps never known. He spoke of living with the land, not on it. He spoke of the earth as a blanket, not an enemy. Inside the chest, beneath a bundle of dried herbs, was his journal. Its leather cover was cracked, and its pages were filled with a spidery, precise script, detailing principles of construction that defied the simple logic of log and timber. He wrote of thermal mass, of the Earth's constant, unwavering temperature, and of shelters built not against the hillside, but within it. He called it a Valda Hala, an old-world term for a stone hollow. For hours, she read by the flickering light of a tallow candle, the words of her grandfather, a posthumous gift of hope. He described a dwelling that required a fraction of the firewood of a conventional cabin because its very walls, thick with stone and earth, held the heat. A home that was warmed by the planet itself. The plan was audacious. It was unorthodox. To the people of Providence Creek, it would seem like madness. But as she looked at the meager pile of logs beside her hearth, she knew that conventional thinking was a luxury she could no longer afford. The next morning, she made a decision. She would not beg for scraps from the council's table. She would not surrender to the winter. She would dig her own salvation out of the useless rock of her own land. She would build a stone hollow. Her first act was one of calculated sacrifice. She took the last of her husband's prized possessions, a set of German steel chisels and a finely balanced felling axe, to the general store. The proprietor, a man named Thorne who also sat on the council, gave her a pitying look, but a fair price. The transaction netted her $27. From this small fortune, she immediately spent $17. She purchased a new head for her pickaxe, 2 sturdy iron shovel blades, a coil of rope, and, after a moment of careful consideration, 4 sticks of blasting powder with fuses. It was a tool of miners, dangerous and unfamiliar to most, but Thomas had spoken of it often, and Alara had listened. The remaining $10 she secreted away, a final reserve against absolute catastrophe. Her land was considered the poorest plot in the valley, precisely because of the feature she now saw as its greatest asset, a massive granite hillside that formed its northern boundary. The stone was why the soil was thin and the trees were stunted. The townsfolk called it Vance's Folly. But her grandfather's journal was specific. The shelter must be cut into a south-facing slope to capture the low winter sun. The granite monolith on her property offered a perfect southern face, a sheer wall of rock that baked in the afternoon light. On October 25th, she began. The first task was to clear the face of the hill. For 3 days, she worked with an axe and shovel, clearing away the thorny scrub brush and prying loose the smaller boulders at its base. Her hands, soft from a year of domesticity, were soon raw and blistered. The muscles in her back and shoulders burned with a fire that did not fade at nightfall. Each evening she would return to her cold cabin, rub her hands with tallow, and study her grandfather's diagrams by candlelight, her physical exhaustion overshadowed by a fierce, singular purpose. The town watched. From a distance, they saw the lone figure of a girl hacking away at the base of the hill. Silas Abernathy rode by on his mare, slowing to observe the strange activity. He did not speak to her, but simply shook his head with a look of profound disappointment before riding on. The word spread through Providence Creek. The poor Vance girl had finally been broken by grief. She was digging her own grave. The mockery was quiet at first, couched in feigned concern. Someone should speak to her, women whispered over their sewing circles. It is not right for a young woman to be engaged in such coarse labor. After a week of clearing, she was ready to break ground. She marked out the dimensions of the entrance with stakes and twine, following her grandfather's notes precisely. An arched opening, 4 feet wide and 7 feet high. The granite was unyielding. Her first blows with the pickaxe produced little more than a shower of sparks and a jarring vibration that shot up her arms. For 2 days, she hammered at the rock, her progress measured in inches. It was here that her $17 investment would prove its worth. Working with the blasting powder was a matter of extreme caution. She remembered Thomas describing the process, his voice calm and methodical, as he explained the art of drilling the hole, setting the charge, tamping it with damp clay, and laying a long fuse. Using a star drill and a sledgehammer, she spent an entire day pounding a hole 2 feet deep into the center of her marked archway. The work was brutal, each strike of the hammer a shock to her system. By dusk, she was ready. She set the charge, packed the hole, and laid the fuse, giving it a generous length. As twilight settled, she lit the end and ran, scrambling behind a rocky outcropping 200 yards away. The explosion was not a deafening boom, but a deep, resonant crack that echoed through the valley. It sounded like the world breaking a bone. When the dust settled, she approached with a lantern. A deep crater had been blown into the rock face, and a web of fractures radiated outward. A mountain of shattered granite lay at her feet. The heart of the hill had been broken open. The blast had done in a second what would have taken her a month of hammering. More importantly, it had given her a starting point and a wealth of raw material. The larger, fractured pieces of granite could now be pried loose with a crowbar. The next phase of the work was excavation. It was a slow, rhythmic, and punishing process. Pry loose a boulder. Break it into manageable pieces with the sledgehammer. Haul the pieces away on a crude sledge she built from 2 saplings and some rough-sawn planks. Then, return for the smaller rocks and soil, shoveling them into a bucket, carrying them out, and dumping them. She established 2 piles, one for large flat stones suitable for building, and another for soil and rubble. Day after day, she burrowed deeper into the hillside. Her goal was an interior chamber 12 feet wide and 16 feet deep, with a gently vaulted ceiling that would rise to 8 feet at its center. The town's quiet mockery grew louder. At the general store, when Alara came in to buy flour and salt, the men would fall silent, watching her. Mr. Thorne once asked, "Still digging that badger den, Mrs. Vance? You will find the damp gets in your bones something fierce." Alara simply looked at him. "The earth is not damp, Mr. Thorne. It is constant. It is the air that carries the damp and the cold." She paid for her goods and left, her quiet confidence doing more to irritate them than any angry retort could have. The men took to calling her project Ilara's Folly, or the Gopher Hole. They would lay bets on how long she would last before she gave up or froze. Abernathy made his opinion public at a Sunday service, speaking abstractly about the dangers of pride and of women who stepped outside their divinely appointed station. He spoke of the wisdom of tradition and the proven methods of their forefathers, all while the subject of his sermon was a mile away, hauling rocks from the belly of a hill. By mid-November, the outer shell of the chamber was complete. The hole was dug. Now came the work of finishing it, of turning a cave into a home. This was where her grandfather's genius truly lay. He wrote that a simple cave would indeed be damp, as condensation would form on the cold rock walls. The key was to line the interior, creating a barrier and harnessing the rock's thermal properties without living directly against it. Using the flat stones she had so carefully saved from the excavation, she began to build interior walls. It was painstaking work, fitting the stones together like a complex puzzle. Her mortar was a recipe from the journal, a thick, sticky mixture of the clay-rich soil from the hillside, fine sand from the creek bed, and wood ash from her cabin's hearth. She mixed it in a wooden trough, adding water until it was the consistency of thick porridge. With a small trowel, she laid a bed of the mortar and set each stone, carefully filling the gaps. She left a 2-inch air gap between her new wall and the raw earth of the hill, a crucial detail her grandfather insisted would prevent moisture from ever touching the living space. As the walls rose, the chamber began to feel less like a cave and more like a room, a sanctuary of stone. The work was all-consuming. She rose before the sun, worked until her muscles screamed, ate a simple meal of bread and dried meat, studied the journal, and fell into an exhausted sleep. She lost track of days. Her only calendar was the slow, steady progress of her stone walls and the deepening chill in the air. The most critical and difficult element of the design was the chimney. The skeptics had called her future home a tomb, and without proper ventilation, they would have been right. Her grandfather's design was ingenious. It was not a conventional brick chimney, but a channel carved directly through the granite. She identified a section of the ceiling near the back of the chamber and began the arduous process of carving a flue, an 8-inch by 8-inch square shaft that had to go straight up through more than 10 feet of solid rock. This was the work of the German steel chisels she had sold and now bitterly missed. She had to make do with a hardened iron spike and her sledgehammer. For weeks, this was her world. Standing on a makeshift scaffold, she would hold the spike against the ceiling and strike it, over and over, chipping away at the granite, a fragment at a time. The noise was deafening in the enclosed space. The dust was a constant irritant in her lungs. It was the most physically and mentally taxing work she had ever done. To keep the flue straight, she would periodically lower a lit candle on a string to check her progress. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the spike broke through. A sliver of pale gray daylight shone down the shaft. She had reached the surface. Her work was not yet done. A fire needed to breathe. Following another diagram, she carved a second, smaller channel, a 4-inch intake vent near the floor on the opposite side of the chamber. This would draw fresh, cold air from outside, feeding the fire and creating a constant, gentle circulation that would pull smoke up the flue and keep the air in the chamber fresh. It was a simple, elegant system based on the fundamental principles of thermodynamics. By the first week of December, with the first snows already dusting the ground, the interior was complete. She built the facade last, using the largest and most uniform blocks of granite. She constructed a wall 2 feet thick, mortaring the stones with her clay mixture. She left a single opening for a door, narrow and easily defended against the wind. The door itself was her final piece of craftsmanship. She used salvaged timbers from a collapsed shed on her property, laminating 2 layers together with the grain running in opposite directions to prevent warping. She insulated the core with wool from her family's old spinning supplies and covered the exterior with a cured deer hide. Hung on heavy iron hinges she had scavenged, it fit the stone frame with satisfying precision. On December 10th, she moved in. She transferred her few possessions from the cold, drafty cabin: a straw-filled mattress, 2 woolen blankets, a cast-iron pot, a small crate of tinned goods, and her grandfather's journal. She built a raised sleeping platform of wood against the back wall, ensuring she would be well above the cold stone floor. She carved shelves directly into the softer earthen sections of the wall for her food. Lastly, she laid a fire in the stone-lined fire pit she had built directly beneath the chimney flue. She struck a match. The kindling caught and flames licked at the larger pieces of split pine. For a tense moment, a puff of smoke entered the room. Then, the draft caught. The smoke swirled and was drawn cleanly up the flue, disappearing into the rock. A steady, gentle warmth began to fill the chamber. The stone walls, cool to the touch, began to absorb the heat. There was no draft. There was only a profound, enveloping silence. The roar of the wind outside reduced to a distant whisper. The air smelled of clean earth, dry stone, and wood smoke. It smelled of safety. She had spent a total of 47 days of ceaseless labor and had used just under $20 in materials. The cost in pride and social standing was incalculable. A trapper named Elias Kane, a man who read the sky and the trees better than most men read a book, passed through Providence Creek on December 15th. He stopped at the general store for supplies, his face grim. "Never seen the signs like this," he told the men gathered around the stove. "The squirrels are hoarding deep, the bark on the north side of the oaks is thick as my thumb, and there's an ice ring round the moon that speaks of a reckoning. This ain't gonna be a normal winter. This is an almanac winter, the kind they tell stories about." Silas Abernathy, who was there to purchase a tin of expensive tobacco, scoffed. "Elias, you say that every year. We have our wood stacked and our larders full. We are a prepared people. We trust in God and our own two hands, not in squirrel superstitions." The other men laughed, their confidence buoyed by Abernathy's certainty. The trapper just shook his head, pulled his fur cap down, and left. He did not stay the night in town, preferring the shelter of a pine grove in the woods. Alara, meanwhile, was making her own final preparations, guided not by superstition, but by a deep and cautious respect for the power she was about to face. She spent 2 full days hauling the last of her firewood, the meager quarter cord allotted by the council, inside her shelter, stacking it neatly against a sidewall. She filled 2 large barrels with fresh water from the creek, a laborious task that involved melting the surface ice with a heated rock. Her stores of dried meat, beans, and flour were organized on her earthen shelves. She was ready. The storm arrived on the evening of December 18th, 1876. It did not begin with a gentle flurry of snow. It came as an assault. The sky, which had been a sheet of metallic gray all day, turned a terrifying, bruised black. The temperature, which had hovered around 10 degrees Fahrenheit, plummeted with an almost audible rush. Within an hour, it was well below zero. Then the wind came, a solid wall of force that shrieked down from the mountains. It was a physical presence, a thing with weight and malice. It slammed into the timber houses of Providence Creek, testing every joint, finding every crack. And with the wind came the snow. Not falling, but driven horizontally, a blinding, stinging torrent of white that erased the world. Inside her stone hollow, Alara felt the change. The wind did not howl. It produced only a low, resonant hum against the thick stone facade, like a distant cello note. The temperature inside, which had been a steady 58 degrees, dropped by only a few points. Her fire, a small, efficient blaze of 3 logs, was all she needed. The immense thermal mass of the surrounding granite and earth, warmed by her small fire and the latent heat of the planet itself, was a bulwark against the savage cold outside. The stone walls, having absorbed warmth all day, now radiated it back to her, creating an even, comfortable heat. She sat on her sleeping platform, mending a tear in a wool blanket, the flickering firelight casting a warm, golden glow on the stone. She was sealed in the heart of the hill, a passenger in a vessel of earth, navigating a sea of impossible cold. The silence was the most remarkable thing. The storm was a distant rumor, a story being told somewhere far away. In the town of Providence Creek, the story was a terrifying reality. The people were not living in shelters. They were trapped in cooling boxes. The wind, with its relentless, searching fingers, pried at their homes. It forced its way through the chinking between the logs, around window frames, and under doors. The heat from their roaring fireplaces was sucked away almost as soon as it was generated. Families were forced to burn through their precious wood supplies at a rate they had never imagined. A week's worth of wood was gone in a single night. In Silas Abernathy's large two-story house, the finest in the settlement, the patriarch himself was engaged in a losing battle. He and his son fed log after log into the massive stone fireplace that was the centerpiece of his parlor. Despite the blaze, frost was creeping up the inside of the window panes, thick and ornate like ferns. His wife and daughter were huddled under a mountain of quilts in the same room, their faces pale with fear. "Silas, the wood!" his wife whispered, her voice trembling. "We have already burned through so much." "We have plenty," he snapped, his voice louder than necessary, a flimsy defense against the fear coiling in his own gut. "This house was built to last. The storm will break by morning." But the storm did not break. It intensified. The snow began to accumulate with terrifying speed. By the first morning, it was 3 feet deep. By the second, it was over 6 feet, burying the lower windows of most houses. The world became a suffocating prison of white and roaring wind. The temperature outside, as measured by the spirit thermometer on Abernathy's porch before the snow buried it, had dropped to 30 degrees below zero. The wind made it feel like 100 below. The days blurred into a nightmare of cold, darkness, and fear. The constant, high-pitched scream of the wind was a torment. The snow piled higher, drifting against the houses, sealing them in. The weight was immense. On the second night, the town heard a sound like a cannon shot, followed by a muffled crash. It was the roof of the meeting hall, collapsing under the load. Panic began to set in. Families ran out of wood and began to burn furniture, chairs, tables, anything that would catch fire. The smoke from their desperate fires could not escape the snow-choked chimneys properly, filling the cabins with a blinding, choking haze. For 3 days and 3 nights, the blizzard raged without pause. Inside her shelter, Alara kept her routine. She ate, slept, and tended her small economical fire. She used only a dozen logs a day. The temperature inside never dropped below 60 degrees. She was warm, she was safe, and she was alone with the knowledge that the world outside was being unmade. She could feel the immense pressure of the snow on the hillside above her, but the arch of her ceiling, a design her grandfather had praised for its inherent strength, held firm. She was living inside a principle of physics, and it was keeping her alive. On the morning of the 4th day, December 22nd, she awoke to an unfamiliar sensation: silence. The wind had stopped. The deep, resonant hum against her door was gone. A pale, diffuse light filtered down her chimney flue. The storm was over. She waited an hour, listening, before unlatching her heavy door. It would not budge. She pushed with her shoulder. It was solid. A wall of snow had drifted against it, sealing her in as surely as the rock had. But she was prepared. Taking her shovel, she began to dig her way out through the chimney. It was a slow, awkward process, pushing the snow down ahead of her, but the shaft was only 10 feet long. After an hour of work, her shovel broke through into open air. She clambered out into a world that was utterly alien. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue. The sun, dazzling on the fresh snow, made the landscape glitter as if it were paved with diamonds. But the beauty was terrifying. The valley was gone, buried beneath a smooth, undulating blanket of white. The snow was drifted in immense waves, reaching 20 feet high in places. The tops of the tallest pine trees were mere bushes poking through the surface. Of Providence Creek, there was almost no sign. Only a few dark shapes, the peaks of the sharpest roofs, broke the surface. There was no smoke from any chimney. There was no sound. The silence was absolute, the silence of a graveyard. A cold dread, far more chilling than the winter air, seized her. These people had mocked her, scorned her, and left her to her fate. But they were still her people, her neighbors. She could not leave them buried. Strapping on the snowshoes she had made weeks before, a simple but effective design of bent willow and rawhide, she took up her shovel and a flask of hot broth she had prepared. She began the arduous trek toward the town, her small figure the only moving thing in a vast, frozen tableau. The journey was a struggle against the landscape itself. The snow was light and powdery in some places, letting her sink to her waist, and hard-packed as ice in others. It took her nearly 2 hours to cover the mile to the nearest house, which belonged to the Gable family. All she could see was the very peak of the roof. The rest was entombed. She shouted their name, her voice sounding small and thin in the immense quiet. There was no answer. She began to dig. She dug with a methodical fury, desperation lending strength to her arms. She targeted the area where she knew the front door was, shoveling tons of snow, creating a narrow trench that descended toward the buried house. After an hour, her shovel struck wood, the top of the door frame. She cleared it and hammered on the door. "Mr. Gable! It is Alara Vance! Are you alive in there?" A faint, weak cry came from within. She put her shoulder to the door, but the snow pressure from the other side held it fast. Using the handle of her shovel as a lever, she managed to pry it open a few inches, just enough to squeeze through. The darkness and cold inside were shocking. The Gable family, the councilman, his wife, and their 2 small children, were huddled together under a single blanket. Their fire had been out for more than a day. The room was filled with a faint haze, and the air was dangerously cold. They were alive, but only just. Their faces were pale, their lips blue, their movements sluggish with the onset of severe hypothermia. Mr. Gable stared at her as if she were an angel or a ghost. "Mrs. Vance," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. We burned everything. The chairs, the table." "There is no time for that," Alara said, her tone firm but not unkind. "You must move. You must come with me. I have shelter. I have warmth." She gave them the broth, forcing the warm liquid past their lips. Slowly, painfully, she helped them out of their frozen house and led them back through the trench she had dug, toward the safety of her stone hollow. The journey back was a slow, agonizing procession, the children nearly too weak to walk. When they finally stumbled through the door of her shelter, the warmth hit them like a physical blow. They collapsed near the fire, weeping with a mixture of relief and pain as feeling began to return to their frozen limbs. Ilara left them there and went back out. She went to the Thorns' house next, and then the Millers'. The scene was the same at each. Families trapped in frozen tombs, their fuel gone, their hope extinguished. She dug them out, one by one, and led the dazed survivors back to her sanctuary. Her small, 192-square-foot chamber was soon crowded with the shivering, grateful people who had once pitied her foolishness. Her last stop was the Abernathy house. It was the largest home, and it had suffered the most. One entire section of the roof had collapsed under the weight of the snow, leaving a gaping hole to the sky. She dug her way to a window and broke the frosted glass. "Mr. Abernathy!" she called into the darkness. The voice that answered was not the booming, confident tone of the town leader, but the broken whisper of a terrified man. "Here. We are here." She found them in the kitchen, the one room that was still partially intact. Silas Abernathy was huddled with his wife and daughter, a heavy oak table tilted over them as a meager shield from the snow that had poured in through the ruined ceiling. Abernathy's face, when he saw her in the lantern light, was a mask of shame and disbelief. The pillar of the community had crumbled. "My folly," he choked out, looking at the ruin of his home. "My pride." Alara did not offer words of comfort or reproach. She simply said, "Can you walk?" He nodded, and she led his family, the last of the survivors, on the final journey back to the stone hollow. That night, 15 souls were sheltered in Alara's folly. They huddled together in the warm, secure space, listening as Alara recounted the principles from her grandfather's journal. She explained the simple, profound physics of their survival. The thermal mass of the Earth, the south-facing aspect, the crucial importance of the ventilation system that had kept the air fresh and the smoke drawing cleanly. They listened with a reverent awe, their arrogance stripped away by the brutal lesson of the blizzard. Not one of them had lost a family member, though many had come perilously close. Not one had burned through their wood supply as quickly as those in town. And not one, as they sat in the life-saving warmth of the shelter they had mocked, would ever again doubt the wisdom they had been too proud to see. They were the lucky ones. In the days that followed, as the survivors began to dig out the rest of the town, the full scope of the tragedy became clear. 18 people had not survived. The O'Connell family, with their newborn baby, had been found frozen in their beds. Old Man Hemlock, who lived alone, had been asphyxiated by a smoke-filled cabin. The blizzard had not just been a storm, it had been a judgment, a brutal culling of those who had placed their faith in flawed traditions. In the center of the crowded shelter, Silas Abernathy finally stood. His face was etched with a grief and humility that had been entirely foreign to him a week before. He looked at Alara, and in front of all the survivors, his voice thick with emotion, he spoke. "We called this place a folly," he said, his gaze sweeping over the warm, life-filled room. "We were the fools. We built our homes with pride and timber, and they became our tombs. You built yours with wisdom and stone, and it has become our ark." He looked directly at Alara, his eyes clear of their former arrogance. "We owe you our lives, Mrs. Vance. I was wrong. We were all wrong." The vindication was absolute, but there was no triumph in it. There was only the somber reality of the empty cabins and the freshly dug graves in the frozen ground. Alara Vance had been proven right. She had survived, and she had saved the remnant of her community. In the heart of the unforgiving winter, standing at the door of the shelter she had carved from the earth, she was no longer the town outcast. She had become its foundation.